Ridegear Guybrave, the bravest guy to ever ride some gears. This is an import PS1 title, and a pretty decent one, but I do have to stress, if you're thinking about getting this one, it's one of those things where you should probably adjust your expectations. This was the first game ever developed by a small developer known as Avit, a company known for a grand total of 5 titles, 2 of which fall under this brand, and they didn't do much else as far as I can tell. Understanding that this is sort of their first attempt at a game, it does seem like a fairly reasonable first introductory game. This is a piece of advice I'd give anyone aspiring to be a game developer. Before you make your huge 80-hour epic game, make like a small project, just to make sure that you have something out there that you can publish. Don't do what I did and spend your entire life working on a single game only to have it completely destroyed by a natural disaster. Trust me, that ain't fun. No, instead these guys went and made a relatively simple game, and provided that you understand that it is more or less sort of a proof of concept title budget sort of experience, I think you can have some fun with this. Now the story, from what I can tell, follows 4 brave mech pilots. Okay, well, they're called Ridegears, but they're mechs. They're mech pilots. On the quest to save their dear friend Momo-chan from this guy I affectionately like to call Not Dozel Zabi piloting the not-so-big Zam. Well, that's at least the early bits of the story, but again, it's in Japanese, so my understanding of it isn't great. There are some story beats, and there is a little bit more intrigue as plot goes on, but again, it's in Japanese, so I can't give you much more than the initial conceit and what little I can parse just from hearing the audio. That said, the story itself is alright, again, provided we understand that this is a smaller game and more of a sort of budget experience. It's not special, it's not fantastic, but it definitely works. As with all imports, one of the biggest things for me anyway, as someone who can't really understand the story, is the gameplay, and this one is a pretty interesting sort of combination of concepts. It's sort of like half RPG, half 2D beat 'em up, but your characters are like these little chibi mechs, and you can even hop out of them at times. Although that feature is, like, never really utilized. The RPG elements are relatively simple and pretty much just revolve around leveling up your mech pilot of choice, though it's worth knowing every single mech levels independently, but the levels all feel more or less identical between the two, so really just pick the guy you like the most from the start, and then go. Don't be like me and realize halfway through that, oh crap, I can play as the blue Veritech pilot? Well, hell yeah, I'm playing as Max Sterling. So yeah, this game's also another epic chapter in the Robotech saga. Awesome! Now, the levels themselves for your mechs aren't terribly interesting. Basically, you kill enough enemies and you gain enough experience, which exponentially increases your health. And that's most of what every single level entails, is just a health increase. But the more exciting half of every level up is that you gain new abilities for your basic beat-em-up attacks, for your melee weapons, which is pretty cool. Getting stuff like throws, grabs, charges. I didn't find too many that were terribly interesting, but it's kind of cool that you do get new abilities with every level. Unfortunately, those are pretty much entirely tied to your melee attacks, and melee isn't necessarily the way to go in terms of combat. See, your characters are equipped with both a melee weapon and a ranged weapon. Now, your weapons vary in terms of usefulness, in the sense that your ranged weapon has an energy tank that it relies on in order to shoot. Basically, it's an ammo counter. You have 3 different energy canisters, each one tied to a different weapon, although you can just menu through and swap your weapons to each canister as you run out. Unfortunately, there's no way to just equip one ranged weapon and have all 3 canisters equipped to that. You really do have to go through the menu each time, which is a pain. And the thing is, you can't equip multiples of the same ranged weapon, so it's not even as simple as, okay, I've got this one ranged weapon I really, really like, I'm just gonna equip all 3 slots with that. No, you gotta go through the menu every single time. And there are certain situations that prevent you from doing this, so it's not fantastic. Indeed, melee weapons are kind of similar in the sense that for some reason, despite your mech only having 2 arms, you can have 3 melee weapons, but there's not really a reason for you to have so many different melee weapons. It's cool in the sense that every melee weapon sort of behaves differently. Your starting little sword is different from, say, the yo-yo weapon, which is different from, say, the lightsaber, or the drill or the chainsaw or like the throwing axes, they all behave differently, and that's really damn cool. But why do I need 3 separate slots for each of them? They're not really side grades. Yes, they do behave differently, but each one is a statistical level up from each other. In fact, this is actually part of what makes this game pretty good as an import, is you're not going to spend a lot of time figuring out which weapon is best when you simply go to a store. All the weapons are priced, and if you weren't just looking at the highest price as being the best thing, they actually spell out the numeric values of each attack, so you can see which one is functionally the best if you aren't looking at the price. Also, you can just look at the picture of the weapon, so you don't have to worry about having to deal with reading text, which is also a big plus. Now, the ranged weapons, they work on your energy tanks, and this creates a little bit of resource management. These things are typically, from what I find, the most powerful weapons in the game, and they are inherently ranged weapons, so they can take out enemies before they even show up on screen, and missiles track, so yeah, they're kind of a game changer. This is awesome. So managing that energy, really important, but what's kind of weird is that the later melee weapons are also ranged weapons that don't run on energy at all. Like, they might not do as much damage, but they can juggle enemies and leave them permanently stun-locked, so, you know, just get your Gatling gun and you've pretty much beaten the game right there. It's a little weird like that. Now, aside from weapons, there are a couple other little bits and bops to your character. You can equip different shields, although these aren't super useful. There's a little bit of a delay in deploying your shields, which means most of the time when I tried to shield something, the shield would deploy after I got hit, and it was a waste of time. So I didn't really invest in shields too much, but what is cool is as you get further down the game, you gain omnidirectional barriers. And what's really neat about that is the first omnidirectional barrier is actually statistically a bit of a downgrade, but you're protected from all directions, so you can just sort of jet forward with your shields without having to really worry too much about being attacked from behind. That's kind of really awesome. There's also motor upgrades, which affect the motors of your arms and legs, although honestly, I could not for the life of me tell you what these things actually do. I think your arm motors affect attack speed and your leg motors affect movement speed, but the differences seem so negligible, I didn't really bother using them after I upgraded my first mech halfway through the game. Like, they just didn't really seem to be worth the money, and they got really expensive by the end, so I never bothered with that. Now that you've kitted out your mech, it's time to head out into the field and boom! 2D beat 'em up. Yeah, now the RPG elements are kind of all out the window, and you just have to sort of 2D scroll your way to the end and destroy all the enemies on the field. Now, the enemies don't spawn indefinitely, and there is a hard cap of 3 enemies on the field at any one time. However, if you kill all the enemies in a set area, you get an experience bonus, and then you just have to move on your merry little way. In order to navigate this world, you have to go through all these different little encounter areas, and this I don't like. Honestly, once you clear an area, you have to physically go through it each time, and every time you clear a room, it repopulates with enemies the next time you're there. So basically, if you walked from one end of the island to the other, you'd have to go through every single screen, fighting every single enemy, and only able to really recharge with whatever inventory you have, and hopefully get to a town to recover. And this actually leads to a bit of an issue. See, if you die in-game, the game's fine with that. Sort of. Basically, it will respawn you at the nearest junction between 2 areas that you were last at. However, it will only respawn you with half health, and it will not refill your weapon energy at all. Now, if you could simply skip combat areas once you've beaten them, this would make navigation between areas relatively simple. However, because you have to manually navigate each and every single environment, whether you've already cleared the area or not, this kind of leads to problems. A couple times during the later half of my playthrough of this, I ended up in this weird situation where I was trying to get from one end of the island to the other, and unlike the early game where there's a town in between each combat area, you'd sometimes have to go 2 or 3 areas in a row before you'd see a town. And if you died somewhere between because you were just trying to run through the area and rush it without fighting anything, well, you might respawn in a junction between 2 areas with no way of healing, no weapon energy, and all you can really do is take pot shots at enemies hoping they drop a healing item so that you might have a chance to survive, to get through the area, to have to deal with it all over again to hopefully eventually get back to town. The respawning mechanics in this are not great. They don't give you weapon energy back, which means that, you know, most of your weapons are kind of basically invalid if you've already run out of energy, and they only respawn you with half health, which means you're already at a serious disadvantage, and at the later stages of this game, that's basically a death sentence, especially if it respawns you between two combat areas. Now, there is another thing about gameplay I haven't really talked about. You can also give it like a 3/4 like isometric camera perspective, but the game doesn't really take into account this for control. It still controls like it's completely 2D, so using this camera really just serves to make the controls really awkward and confusing and not really make sense. But there's a few different camera angles that let you kind of change your perspective a little bit. I still ended up enjoying the 2D perspective just because while there is ostensibly depth in this game, for the most part it's not really ever utilized by enemies. They use it to try and like skirt around to like get behind you, but even if you just stand in the middle of an area with a ranged weapon, you'll still probably hit them. This game is weird at acknowledging its own depth. Like, it is kind of 3D, but it doesn't really play like it. It's weird. But there are camera options for some reason. You can also zoom in and out for camera. I assume that's mostly just to make multiplayer a little bit more nice looking, so that you can sort of manage both characters on screen at once, but the camera options to this game aren't fantastic. And that's kind of the game in a nutshell. It's not overly complicated. You go from area to area defeating enemies, hoping to slowly advance the plot and eventually beat the game. That's really it. It's not any more complicated than that, and I've pretty much talked about basically everything mechanics-wise this game has to offer, except for the Colosseums, which are really just a way to grind money, which there isn't really a ton of need for. Like, on the later chunk of the game, weapons get really expensive, but you're still killing things so fast that it doesn't really matter. So the Colosseums, while they're kind of interesting, and I think I did actually get a weapon for clearing the latter Colosseum, I didn't really see any point to it. Like, it was a thing I could do, I guess, but that's about it. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but one of the biggest things when it comes to imports is, of course, the language barrier and how much of a barrier to entry that's going to be. And this game, I think it's not a bad game to get into if you can't understand a lick of Japanese like me, but I want to put a giant asterisk next to that. See, well, like I said, weapons and upgrades and everything you can buy in shops are shown visibly and have numbers attached so that you can easily understand what each and everything is and how effective it is without understanding like what it is by reading it. Unfortunately, there are some like weird roadblocks in the game itself that create some problems. Some are a little bit easier to deal with than others, but they're all kind of fundamentally the same in the sense that you run into basically just a giant wall and you can't advance. Now, the first one you run into, which was about halfway through my playthrough, is simple enough. You're in a cave, there's a giant rock wall. Well, you go back to the previous town, hey, they're selling a weapon that's a drill, you know, put 2 and 2 together, no problem. Once you kind of finish the island, you end up running to like 3 different like dead ends without any real hint as to what you're supposed to do, and there's no real quick, easy to understand logical solution to this. What I ended up having to do was basically go back to every town and talk to everyone, and then go back to the start and then talk to everyone, and that kind of fixed it, sorta. It's not an elegant solution, and unfortunately having to go back and talk to literally everyone twice is not the best solution for getting into, you know, any sort of import, really. But it will work. It's just a huge waste of time, especially when, once again, you realize you have to navigate all those combat areas again and again and again. It's not great. Combat is fine, you know, equipping your mech, that's great, and even like the first, you know, half of the game, no problem, but when you get to that latter chunk, that's when things get a little bit messy, and it gets a little bit more difficult to recommend. But it's not one of the more complicated games, and at the very least, you can enjoy the gameplay itself for the most part. So, if you're just getting into Japanese, maybe. If you're looking for an interesting import, sure. But if you're looking for a game that's 100% playable without understanding it, this one does have some roadblocks that make that a little bit harder to recommend. Not entirely impossible to recommend, but it's a bit more of a footnote that you should take note of before getting into this. Overall, though, Ridegear Guybrave, from a gameplay perspective, is relatively good. It's not overly complicated. It's not the most fantastically well done game I've ever seen. It's a very simple, you know, budget style game, but it's okay. Now, in terms of presentation, Ridegear Guybrave is kind of like everything else. It's alright. It's not fantastic or anything, but it looks decent. The individual ride gears and the environments, they all look nice, and there are some rather neat effects with some of the backgrounds. For example, walking in the desert, you start out and it's like daytime, and when you get to the other end, it's nighttime. That's kind of a neat effect. And running around like the wintry area and seeing like the aurora and stuff, there are some really nice visual effects here for, again, what I'm going to assume, because it just feels like a low-budget title, could do. The ride gears themselves look very, very good for the most part, although a couple of the earlier ones you run into look a little bit weird. Like there's one that's more or less just a modified crane that just looks like a walking junkyard, and I guess that's the point, but visually it just looks a little muddy to really understand what it's visibly doing. Like it's just a little bit weird. But you know, you run into one that looks like a Trotmobile from Steambot Chronicles, or you run into like one of the automated sort of Terminator ones, and they look quite nice. And your own mech, whichever one you choose, be it the standard ride gear, the one that's basically a big gun, the magical girl mech, or indeed the modified Veritech fighter piloted by good old Max Sterling, they look great. Audio-wise, it's okay. The songs themselves aren't really anything particularly special, and they do repeat songs a lot. However, while the songs themselves aren't particularly fantastic, some of them do have some really nice beats to them, and at the very least I can recognize that much. Overall, presentation-wise, it's okay. It's not fantastic, but it does do some nice things visually. Audio-wise, I could take or leave it. Now, if you want a copy of Ridegear Guybrave on the PS1, cheapest one I'm seeing right now is about $25 shipping included. I had originally bought this game myself for about $1, and this particular copy was graciously donated to me by good old JetWolf68K, along with its sequel and a bunch of other awesome stuff I'm going to be doing in the near future, so look forward to that. And honestly, for $25, that seems a bit high. Like, I've seen PS1 imports go for like $1 each. If you paid maybe $10 for this, maybe 15, that might be worth it. But honestly, I would say this is maybe a $5 or $10 game, because this really does feel ultimately like a very budget title. It's a game where you have to absolutely adjust your expectations, because it was a first attempt by a no-name developer, and yet they still produced, and that alone is worth commending them for it. And the fact that it's a relatively competent and decent fun little beat 'em up, albeit with some issues if you're not familiar with the language, you know, it's an okay pickup. I would say Ridegear Guybrave is one of those games that you add to your collection to pad it out, because you want something that's playable and fun, but not necessarily something you go super far out of your way and like, you know, this is why I'm building my collection. This is the kind of game I want. No, this is one that you add to beef up your collection. It's not bad, it's not fantastic, but you know, it's a good pickup if you can get it cheap. Once again, huge shoutouts and thank yous to JetWolf68K for his awesome contribution. And, you know, this game's a lot of fun. It's not fantastic, but if you're into having sort of a cheap budget experience for a first attempt, developer Avid, you know, they were some brave guys, and I enjoyed riding their gears.